Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, America Pre-Civil War, 1849 to 1861. This lecture will deal with America before the Civil War, the 1850s, and the antebellum South. Stephen A. Douglas, who was born in 1813 and died in 1861, is the most significant of what we call the third generation of American politicians. Stephen A. Douglas's nickname was the Little Giant, probably because he was extremely short in stature, but was a great political intellect of the 1850s and even the late 1840s. Stephen A. Douglas was first elected to Congress when he was 29 years old in 1842, and he was chosen to be a U.S. Senator in 1846. His main platform during the election in 1846 was fighting for Oregon and support for the war with Mexico. He will end up replacing Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster as the most important political figures of the 1850s. One of the philosophical platform of Stephen A. Douglas was an idea that he referred to as popular sovereignty. Now, what is popular sovereignty? Well, this is the political belief that the slavery issue should not be addressed. And the thought was that natural conditions would keep slavery from expanding into the Western territories. Geographically and economically, conditions didn't make sense for slavery to exist in the West. There weren't going to be great plantations out in Texas and Oklahoma. You were going to see more ranching and things like that, where slavery really just wasn't going to be economically feasible. Therefore, his belief was that each state should have the right to decide whether slavery would be legal on their own, and that they should do it by direct election. President Polk decides to retire in 1848 after one term due to some declining health and also because he achieved all of his campaign goals. Both the Whig Party and the Democratic Party had wanted to nominate General Zachary Taylor, the hero of the Mexican-American War. But no one really knew what he was going to do. Both sides went to him and asked him if they would stand for nomination for President of the United States, and eventually he announces that he was a Whig and that he would stand for their party's nomination. So the Whigs will nominate Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor will beat out Henry Clay, General Winfield Scott, his commander during the war, and also Daniel Webster. They choose as his running mate Millard Fillmore of New York to be the vice president. The Democrats will nominate Senator Lewis Cass from Michigan. He'll be chosen over the incumbent Secretary of State, James Buchanan, and over former President Martin Van Buren, who was also hoping to win the Democratic nomination. The Democratic Party will pass as part of its platform Stephen A. Douglas's popular sovereignty, which will call for the individual state to decide their status on slavery. The anti-slavery Democrats will get upset by this, and they will leave the convention, and they will form what will be called the Free Soil Party. And their party will focus on the abolition and or restriction of the institution of slavery. They will nominate as their nominee Martin Van Buren for president, and Charles F. Adams, the son and grandson of two presidents, President John Adams and President John Quincy Adams, as vice president. Now, Van Buren knew that his ticket had no real chance of winning, and that it was most likely going to split the Democratic vote, which would allow the Whig nominee to win. This was acceptable to him because he hated Lewis Cass, but more importantly, he hated the idea of popular sovereignty. Now, during the campaign, The Whig Party will stress Zachary Taylor's anti-party attitude and the fact that he was a war hero. But they're going to remain vague on his policy views and major issues. Part of the reason because they don't know what his policy views or major issues are. Zachary Taylor had never voted before. He had never really given any political speeches. So even the party that's nominating him doesn't know a lot about his ideology. The Democratic Party, they're going to go the complete opposite way. They're going to stress their objection to the national bank. They're going to talk about high tariffs and federal subsidies and how they're against all of those things. The Free Soil Party will argue that both of these parties are beholden to slave owners and that the rich planters were controlling the party agendas and giving the common man no voice. The Whigs themselves say, look, up in the North, when they're campaigning, they're going to focus on the willingness to defer to Congress on major issues. While in the South, while they're campaigning, they're going to talk about the fact that Zachary Taylor is a Louisiana slaveholder who also happens to live in Kentucky. So this is really the first major election where slavery is going to be a big deal. Slavery is really becoming an issue here in 1848. And what happens is that Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore will win the popular vote. They get 47.3% of the popular vote, and they get 42.5%. The Democrats get 42.5%. When it comes to the Electoral College, Taylor and Fillmore will get 163 electoral votes, which is good enough for 56%, and Taylor and Fillmore will be elected president and vice president. Now, this is the first election in U.S. history where every state will vote on the same day. They go to the polls on November 7th, 1848. And realistically, when you look at why the Whig Party wins, it's because the Free Soil Party will split the vote of the Democratic Party in the North. And that'll allow these Whigs, who, by the way, did not normally do well in the North, for the most part. They're going to win states like New York and Pennsylvania, New Jersey and Maryland, states that really weren't heavily, even Delaware. These were still kind of heavily Democratic states. But they also do well in a couple of southern states. They do well in Louisiana. It's the home state of Zachary Taylor. They do well in Kentucky, where he also has a home. So the Whigs do put together a pretty good national campaign strategy. The question is, will they be able, through Zachary Taylor, will they be able to actually govern? That will be the question over the next couple of years. Zachary Taylor. Zachary Taylor will be president from 1849 to 1850. He was born on November 24th, 1784, in Orange County, Virginia. He was the son of Richard Taylor and Sarah Dabney. He was descended from William Brewster, one of the original Pilgrim settlers that came to America aboard the Mayflower, and he was also the second cousin to President James Madison. During his early years, the family moved from Virginia to Louisville, Kentucky. He was not particularly well educated. Many of his contemporaries insisted that while he was a quick learner and he was smart, he was functionally illiterate. In 1808, he joined the U.S. Army as a first lieutenant. He served in the War of 1812, eventually rising to the rank of major. It was during the 1830s that he spent most of his time in the American Southeast fighting the Seminole Indians. When Texas was annexed by the United States in 1845, Taylor was sent to the border to protect from an invasion from Mexican forces. The war made him a national hero. He was the victor of the Battle of Palo Alto and the Battle of Buena Vista. Now, prior to being elected president, Zachary Taylor had never held any political office. In fact, as a career military officer, he had never voted, not even for himself in 1848. Zachary Taylor will be the last United States president also to own slaves while holding office. Now, President Taylor, although he subscribed to the Whig philosophy of legislative government, he does not plan to be a puppet of Congress. He wants to run his administration the way he ran his military command. Let's first look at the foreign policy of the Taylor administration. Now, the United States had begun looking to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama somewhere. They weren't sure exactly where they wanted to put it, but they knew they wanted to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, especially because of the recent annexation of California and Oregon. So they begin reaching out to foreign countries to see if they want to partner up with this. And what comes out of this is the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850. And this is going to be negotiated by John Clayton of the United States and Sir Henry Lytton Bulwer of the United Kingdom. And this treaty will state that the United States and the United Kingdom, if a canal is built across Nicaragua, that they would not claim ownership of that canal, that it would be free for all to use. So this is the first attempt here in 1850 to begin planning the construction of a canal. Now, obviously, it won't be built across the isthmus part of Nicaragua. It'll eventually be built across Panama. Another area that the Taylor administration is going to have to deal with is the European revolutions of 1848. Now, in the late 1840s, you begin to see liberal revolutions break out across Europe. And in 1848, there's a series of them. In France, you see the overthrow of the July monarchy. The German states see many of their traditional rulers overthrown. Same with the Austrian Empire and the Italian city-states. Now, the U.S. obviously is going to support these revolutions because they are democratic revolutions, especially in the German states. But they do ask us for help, and we are hesitant to get involved, obviously because of Washington and his warning to do not get involved in foreign entanglements. By the way, all of these revolutions do, in some way or another, fail. And the U.S. does get a black eye for this because obviously, France had helped us. The Dutch had helped us, and now these other countries are looking to become more democratic and overthrow their royalty and the aristocracy, and we refuse to help. Obviously, we weren't in a military position to do so, so it was the smart thing to do, but a lot of people were not happy with it. Another area that we get involved in is the Franklin Arctic Expedition. Now, Captain Sir John Franklin will leave Great Britain, or the United Kingdom, in 1845, and his goal is to explore the rest of the Arctic Ocean, and he's hoping to find that Northwest Passage, the northern water route to Asia. Now, during the expedition, his ships are icebound in the Canadian Arctic, and Franklin and 128 men are eventually lost due to this expedition. Now, the British still want to get the ship back, they want to get the logs, and they would like to get the bodies and return them to the loved ones if possible. So they do send out a search and rescue mission in 1848. They begin searching the Canadian Arctic, and in 1850, the United States will send 2 ships in order to assist the British. We do actually find the ship. We find the Franklin expedition. We send everything to the British, and to thank us for that, Queen Victoria, at that time the reigning monarch of the United Kingdom, will actually have commissioned a desk built out of Franklin's ship, and that is, of course, the Resolute desk that the President of the United States currently uses in the Oval Office. Now, in the prior lecture, we talked about President Polk signing the legislation into law that will create the United States Department of the Interior. And this is the first new cabinet position that had been created since the founding of the American Republic in 1789. And because this is one of the last acts of the Polk administration, he did it on March 3rd, 1849, he doesn't actually have any say over what happens with this new department. It'll be up to the new administration, and that is, of course, President Taylor. The Interior Department, as I said before, was newly created, and it would take over a lot of the domestic powers of the State Department, and it would also take other organizations in other departments and put them into this specific department, like Indian Affairs and the General Accounting Office. Well, President Taylor will be the one that gets to set up the Department of the Interior. He'll also name the first Secretary of the Interior, and for that he chooses Thomas Ewing Jr. to be the first Secretary of the Interior. Now, California is annexed after the Mexican-American War, and unfortunately becomes an increasingly important province because in 1849, gold is discovered. And the reason why I say this is unfortunate is because normally when a territory joins the Union, there is a period of time before they start carving out states. But when gold is found, this leads to many ethical and legal problems because gold is very important, we all know. And so it's going to start a chain of events that eventually leads to the Civil War in 1861. Now, the miners are rough and hard men, and these people are away from their wives. They make their fortunes in an hour or in minutes, and there will be businesses that spring up to relieve these people of their newly acquired wealth, things like casinos and brothels. So you're going to see a lot of crime spring up as well. You also have ethnicity problems because when California was previously a Mexican province, it had a very small but significant ethnic majority. Mexican Americans were considered to be the actual native European descendants of this area, and whites were considered to be the minority group. Well, as gold is discovered and the Americans begin flooding into California to try to make their money, you're going to see Mexican Americans be treated terribly, considered greasers, and attacked and discriminated against by this American minority. Blacks, by the way, are going to be treated as second-class citizens, so they're not going to be treated well either, and the Native Americans are going to be simply wiped out. And General Taylor, or President Taylor, is watching this, and he realizes that California has to have some kind of government, that it needs some kind of structure. And so what he does is he proposes that we should admit California as a state immediately, forgo the territory period of 20 or 30 years or whatever it's going to be, and just go ahead and bring California in as one single state. And he says we don't need to worry about this slavery idea. Let's just let California decide it itself. Now, the people of California, by the way, they are solidly anti-slavery, but they are for economic reasons. They don't want to see competition for gold seekers. They don't want someone to come in and set up a large-scale mining situation with slave labor. They want everyone to have equal access to making this fortune. And so in October of 1849, California will write a state constitution, and they specifically outlaw slavery in it. And it is approved, and in December of 1849, it's approved by President Taylor, and in December of 1849, California will begin creating a transitional government that will operate under the state constitution. Well, the problem is the Southern politicians are not happy about this, and they're going to argue that California is below the 3630 parallel line. Therefore, it should be open to slavery. And they believe that if they went to President Taylor, that he would intervene on their behalf because, being a slave owner, he should support slavery. And Taylor, although you would think he would, being a slave owner, he's a nationalist. He hated the partisanship that slavery produced. And he'll say no. He refuses to support their cause, and they will begin to argue that they would secede from the Union, and if they didn't, that they would surrender their property rights. Now, President Taylor, being a former U.S. Army general, he threatens to lead the U.S. Army personally, and he promises to hang all the rebel leaders. So Congress decides to meet in an emergency because they realize that they've got to figure something out before the President of the United States does head down south and start hanging people. And the South in Congress will declare their opposition to California entering the Union as a free state because they don't want to upset the balance of power in the Senate. So Henry Clay, along with Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, that second generation of American politicians, will all come out of retirement to try to negotiate some kind of settlement or compromise to allow California to enter as a free state, but also to give the South something they wanted. Well, President Taylor says, that's fine, that's nice, but I'm going to bring California into the Union my way. So I don't care what Congress decides to do. I'm doing it my way. So we see a major break between the executive branch and the legislative branch, and things look like they're getting ready to fall apart. On July 4th, 1850, President Taylor was attending the groundbreaking ceremony for the Washington Memorial, and this was obviously during the Independence Day ceremonies. Now, this was a very hot day in Washington, D.C. They said it was, in the mid to high 80s with 100% humidity. And at that time, there was no such thing as wearing shorts and light shirts. You wore your regular best clothes. So Zachary Taylor was wearing his heavy suits and ties and the jacket. And in order to try to escape some of the heat, he ate large amounts of iced water, cold milk, and cherries. Well, a few days later, he became ill with some kind of unknown digestive ailment. Not sure exactly what it is. And eventually, he succumbed to it. He died on July 9th, 1850. He was the third shortest presidency of all time. He served 16 months. Now, many historians contend he may have been assassinated, but there's no definitive evidence to support the claim. There was some proof that there was arsenic in his body, but not only was arsenic used in medication, but arsenic was also used in the embalming process. Now, since his time in office is so short, he's usually not considered a significant president. But had he lived, that may have been different, especially with his pro-union stance. Succeeding to the presidency is Zachary Taylor's vice president, Millard Fillmore, and Millard Fillmore will serve out the rest of the term from 1850 to 1853. Millard Fillmore was born on January 7th, 1800. He was born in a log cabin in Cuyahoga County, New York. He was the son of Nathaniel Fillmore and Phoebe Millard. He was the first president born after the death of a former president, born 3 weeks after the death of President George Washington. When he was 14 years old, he became an apprentice cloth maker. He was an indentured servant. In 1819, he attended the New Hope Academy for 6 months, and then he quit to clerk for a New York judge. He passed the bar in 1823 and became a practicing lawyer. Fillmore will marry Abigail Powers in 1826, and he has a son, Millard Powers Fillmore, and a daughter, Mary Abigail Fillmore. He founded the prestigious law firm Fillmore and Hall in 1834. Then in 1846, he founded the private University of Buffalo, which today is part of the State University of New York at Buffalo, the largest school in the New York college system. He will serve in the New York State Assembly from 1829 to 1831. He will have 2 terms in the United States House of Representatives from 1833 to 35, and then from 1837 to 1843. Then he leaves the House to run unsuccessfully for governor of New York in 1844. He then won election to be the comptroller of New York from 1848 to 1849. And then, of course, he was vice president of the United States from 1849 to 1850. Fillmore is the second vice president to assume the presidency due to the death of a president due to illness. He is also the last member of the Whig Party to be president of the United States, and he is the last person from a party other than the Republican Party or Democratic Party to be president of the United States. While the presidency changed hands, Congress is still negotiating a compromise bill to deal with slavery in the territories that had been won from the Mexican-American War. Now, Henry Clay will propose a bill that will allow California to enter the Union as a free state, but he'll also promise to pass and enforce a harsher fugitive slave law and also to outlaw slavery in the nation's capital. He hopes that this would give each side something that they had been wanting for a long period of time. Now, President Fillmore recognizes that this is probably the best solution that they're going to get, and so he announces his support for this compromise bill. He does this at the same time that Henry Clay falls ill. He's forced to leave the rest of the negotiations up to Stephen Douglas. And what comes out of the House and Senate is what we call the Compromise of 1850. First, it would admit California to the Union as a free state. Second, it'll settle the territory issue of Texas, which was left undone through the annexation. They will finally set a boundary for the state of Texas, and for all the lands that Texas loses, they will settle it with compensation. Texas was still heavily in debt during its Republic of Texas era, so the U.S. will essentially just buy out the rest of their debt in exchange for the land that had come along with the state of Texas but had not been organized. The third thing they'll do is, from some of that land, they will grant territorial status to New Mexico, so a new territory will be founded out in the west. They will also abolish the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Now it is illegal to sell slaves in the nation's capital. And finally, the Compromise of 1850 will see a passage of a harsher fugitive slave law. So the Compromise of 1850 will pass the House, it passes the Senate, and President Fillmore will sign it into law. But Fillmore found it difficult to enforce the fugitive slave law without showing favor towards the Southern Whigs. So what he decided to do was to appease both sides by enforcing it in the North, while also trying to enforce a law forbidding involvement in Cuba. And this is a big mistake for President Fillmore, because Fillmore has ambitions to be president himself, and this will essentially ruin any credibility he has in the North where he's from. And what's ironic about this is that Fillmore himself is an abolitionist. He wants to see the abolition of slavery, but because he takes the best deal he can get, it ruins essentially his political career. Another issue that Millard Fillmore will have to deal with is the growing Mormon population. In 1850, President Fillmore will appoint Brigham Young as the first governor of the Utah Territory, allowing some Mormon self-rule. The Utah Territory would make up the modern-day states of Utah, Nevada, and parts of the modern-day states of Colorado and Wyoming. A major event during the Fillmore administration is the publication of a book in 1852 called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by a woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe had no firsthand knowledge of her topic. She was neither a professional writer nor an abolitionist, but she was inspired to write the book by the fugitive slave law, and as a goal, she hoped it would highlight the evils of slavery. Now, after its publication, Southern critics would argue that the portrayal of plantation life was distorted. They would argue that not all plantation owners were as evil as the main character, and most historians will concede that that is true. They will also argue that slave characters were atypical of what slaves were in the South at that time. Again, something that could be argued to be true. That being said, the Northerners, who had very little basis to judge the accuracy of slavery, saw the Southern criticisms as being biased and unfair. And the book in the first week will sell 10,000 copies. The first year it sells 300,000 copies. It's second only to the Bible that year in sales. And the result of Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be that many Northerners will become abolitionists, and many people will begin to ask the question, is slavery just? And they'll begin to say, what if all slaves were not as nice and kind and smart as Uncle Tom? Does this make slavery correct? The other thing they'll begin to ask themselves is, what if only one slave owner is as evil as Simon Legree? What if all the rest of the slave owners are great people? Does that still make slavery good or right? So you're going to begin to see a lot of people in the North, not a small minority, but a lot of people in the North begin to ask the question, is slavery right? Should we be doing this? And the answer is, of course, obviously, no. Now, the foreign policy of the Fillmore administration. The first thing that Fillmore is going to have to deal with is the Hungarian Revolution. Louis Kossuth will arrive in the United States in exile after the failed Hungarian revolutions in 1848. He wanted the U.S. to recognize an independent Hungary and to help them in their fight against the Austrian Empire. Now, Kossuth will be supported by wealthy German Americans, which was obviously a major voting bloc here in the United States for the Whig Party. But President Fillmore will refuse. He felt that changing American policy to allow the U.S. to intervene in foreign countries' affairs was antithetical to the founding of the United States. So Kossuth will have to essentially go somewhere else looking for supporters for the Hungarian Revolution. When it comes to Japan, President Fillmore will send Commodore Matthew C. Perry to open Japan to American trade. This will be completed during the administration of Franklin Pierce, though, as this leaves in 1853 and doesn't, or 1852, sorry, and doesn't happen until 1853. But Japan will be visited by the American ships, and Japan will agree to establish both trade and diplomatic relations with the United States of America. In 1852, we have another presidential election. The Whig Party, they're in chaos at this point. The supporters of President Fillmore argued that the Compromise of 1850 was a success. It kept the Union together. His opponents argued that the Compromise of 1850 favored the South over the North, which gave one section of the country more power over the other. The Whigs in the North will support General Winfield Scott of New Jersey. Winfield Scott was at this time the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the general-in-chief of the United States Army. The New England Whigs will support Daniel Webster. The Whigs in the South will support Millard Fillmore. But at the end of the day, General Scott will win the nomination because he gets enough delegates in the nominating campaign, and he will choose William Alexander Graham to be his vice president. The most significant part of this nomination process is that three men, Alvin Beauvais, Horace Greeley, and John C. Fremont, will be very upset with the Whig Party and how this was handled, and they will walk out here in 1852, and they will meet in about a year, and they will found what is now known as the Republican Party. The Democratic Party will choose their nominee at the Democratic National Convention. Lewis Cass, the nominee from 1848, is the frontrunner, along with former Secretary of State James Buchanan and Stephen A. Douglas. But when none of them is able to get the nomination, enough delegates to secure the nomination, they then choose a former congressman and senator by the name of Franklin Pierce. He will be the compromise candidate. And to pacify the supporters of Buchanan, the party will choose William Rufus King of Alabama as their nominee for vice president. By the way, Pierce is going to be perfect for the Democratic Party. He's a political unknown, and he's essentially ambiguous on slavery. The Free Soil Party will also field a candidate during this campaign. They're still the third strongest party here in 1852. They will nominate Senator John P. Hale of New Hampshire and George Washington Julian of Indiana for vice president. You also have three other parties that we're not going to really touch upon much, but I just want to bring them up. First, you have the Liberty Party, which will again withdraw from the Free Soil Party. They will select a slate of candidates for president. Realistically, their only difference between them and the Free Soil is that they felt that the Free Soil Party was moving too slow on abolition and that they were no longer a viable political party. Another party that comes off of the Whig Party is called the Union Party. They split off from the Whigs in 1851. Their primary concern was preserving the Union at any cost. They will nominate Daniel Webster for president and Charles J. Jenkins for vice president. Finally, the Southern Rights Party. The Southern Rights Party will split off of the Democratic Party in 1851. They will nominate Senator George Troup of Georgia for president and former Mississippi Governor John Quitman for vice president. What is their goal? Well, it's one thing. It's to uphold the state's rights in the South. So this will be the election of 1854 with all the major candidates. Now, in 1852, both party platforms were nearly indistinguishable. The election would be fought mainly on personality, not issues. Franklin Pierce was likable and unknown. He was ambiguous on slavery. Winfield Scott, a war hero, was anti-slavery, which hurt him in the South. And any of General Scott's reputation as a war hero was somewhat offset by the fact that Franklin Pierce himself served as a lower-level general in the Mexican-American War. They also came up with a really neat slogan. This happens from time to time. We had Tippecanoe and Tyler too in 1840. Here in 1852, we have "We poked you in 44. We shall pierce you in 1852." So, and shortly before the election, by the way, Union Party nominee Daniel Webster dies, so the states, except for Georgia and Massachusetts, will remove their electors from consideration for the Electoral College. Well, when the election comes down, Pierce and King get 1.6 million votes, Scott and Graham get 1.3 million votes, and Hale gets 155,000 votes. That's still good for about 4.9% of the popular vote. When it comes to the Electoral College, though, Pierce and King get 254 electoral votes, Scott and Graham get 42, and Hale gets none. So Franklin Pierce will win in a landslide, with Winfield Scott only winning Kentucky, Tennessee, Massachusetts, and Vermont. Daniel Webster will receive a substantial amount of the vote in Georgia and Massachusetts, showing that there is some disenfranchisement or disenchantment, with voters. They're not real happy with the two main political parties. The biggest disappointment, though, is just the horrible campaign that the Whigs ran. And this is a devastating defeat for the Whig Party. And mainly it's due to the bitterness between the anti-slavery Whigs and the pro-slavery Whigs. But what didn't help was the death of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who were considered the heart and soul of the Whig movement. And by the end of 1852, 1853, the Whig Party will essentially cease to exist. The pro-slavery Whigs will rejoin the Democratic Party, while the anti-slavery forces in the North will be amongst the founders of the Republican Party in 1854. Now, President Fillmore will return to New York in 1853. He will serve as the Chancellor of the University of Buffalo for a period of time. He did run unsuccessfully for president in 1856. He came in third behind James Buchanan and John C. Fremont. Shortly after he leaves the White House in 1853, his wife Abigail does die. He does remarry in 1858 to Caroline McIntosh, a wealthy widow. He is alive through the American Civil War. He opposed the policies of Abraham Lincoln, but he did also at the same time command what was called the Union Continentals, a corps of home guards of males over 45 in the state of New York. Essentially, that was their version of the National Guard. During Reconstruction, he was a supporter of the policies of President Andrew Johnson, and he dies on March 8th, 1874, after he suffered the effects of a stroke. Franklin Pierce will be president from 1853 to 1857. Franklin Pierce was born on November 23, 1804, in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. He was the son of Benjamin Pierce and Anna Kendrick. Benjamin Pierce was a frontier farmer, a Revolutionary War hero, a state militia general, and a multiple-term governor of New Hampshire. Franklin Pierce will enter Phillips Exeter Academy in the spring of 1820. Then he'll go to Boyden College in the fall. That is where he will strike up a lifetime friendship with both Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wordsworth Longfellow. He will graduate in 1824, and after a 2-year break, he'll go to law school. He passes the bar and begins practicing law in 1827. His political career begins in 1828 when he was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives. He'll eventually become the Speaker of the House. In 1832, at the age of 27 years old, he will be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. This was one of the youngest to date. It is no longer so, but I believe at that time it was the youngest to date for over 100 years. Franklin Pierce will marry Jane Means Appleton in 1834. She was his complete opposite politically. She was a Whig. Religiously, she was devout. He was not. And she was pro-temperance, and he was not. He absolutely loved to drink and have a good time. They will have 3 sons together, 3 boys, Franklin Pierce Jr., Frank Robert Pierce, and Benjamin Pierce. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1836. He'll serve until he resigns in 1842. He'll then return to his law practice. His father and others had wanted him to run for governor or to become the attorney general for President Polk. Both of those things he refused to do. Instead, he served as a U.S. district attorney for New Hampshire from 1845 to 1847. And then during the Mexican-American War, Pierce will join the volunteers as a colonel. In March of 1847, he was then appointed a brigadier general of volunteers, and he'll fight closely alongside General Winfield Scott, who ironically he defeated in the election of 1852. He was wounded at the Battle of Contreras when he fell from his horse. He ended up having to withdraw from a battle, the Battle of Churubusco, due to this injury. A lot of his political enemies would use this later in his career to accuse him of cowardice. But regardless of this particular instance, he showed himself to be a very skilled military commander. Despite the fact that he was not a professional soldier, he was a political appointee. After the war, he serves as president of the New Hampshire State Constitutional Convention in 1850. Oh, and by the way, he is also an ancestor of a more modern president. He is an ancestor of Barbara Pierce. Barbara Pierce happened to marry a man by the name of George Herbert Walker Bush. So he is an ancestor of President George W. Bush through his mother, Barbara. Now, upon his election, Franklin Pierce will become the youngest man ever elected president at the age of 48. He was also the only person elected president from the state of New Hampshire, and that still is true today. Sadly, President Pierce was plagued with tragedy. He just had a terrible couple of months before he became president. While traveling to his inauguration, his train derailed near Andover, Maryland. Pierce and his wife will escape, but their 11-year-old son Benjamin is crushed to death by the train. Within a few weeks of his inauguration, former First Lady Abigail Fillmore dies, followed by his vice president, William Rufus King, in April of 1853. So he will serve his entire term other than about a month with no vice president. One thing that Pierce did look forward to, though, is being president because he felt that all the great problems of our time had been handled. and therefore he hoped to preside over an era of peace and prosperity. Another era of good feelings, like James Monroe had had. Unfortunately, events are soon going to begin to undermine any chance of having another era of good feelings. The first major accomplishment of the Pierce administration is called the Gadsden Purchase. The Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, will advocate for the construction of a transcontinental railroad along the southern border of the United States. In order to do this, he recommends a land purchase from Mexico. So President Pierce will send the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, James Gadsden, to negotiate a purchase of 29,000 square miles of Mexican territory for approximately $10 million. You can see that in yellow on the map on this slide. It includes Tucson, Sierra Vista, and Yuma. They do agree to this, so the U.S. does purchase this 29,000 square miles for approximately $10 million, and this is considered the greatest success of the Pierce administration. Moving on with foreign policy, Franklin Pierce will also have to deal with the growing sentiment to purchase Cuba. Now, the United States has always, for some reason or another, always been obsessed with the island nation of Cuba. We have since the early 1800s, and here in the 1850s, President Pierce again is going to try to purchase Cuba from the Spanish Empire. This time he's going to offer them $100 million. Now, this causes outrage in the North because Cuba would enter eventually as a slave state, or worst case scenario, be broken up into multiple slave states, which would permanently upset the balance of power in the United States Senate. What makes things even worse is that there is a secret agreement by the Pierce cabinet called the Ostend Manifesto. And this is essentially a political statement signed by the members of the Pierce cabinet that stated that the United States should take Cuba by force if the purchase negotiations failed. This will permanently discredit the expansionist policies of the Democratic Party, who for a long time said they were just trying to make the country bigger. Now it's obvious that they're trying to seize political control and have a permanent slave majority, slave owner friendly majority in the Senate and in the Electoral College. And Manifest Destiny and Popular Sovereignty will also suffer because of this as well. So again, we try to purchase Cuba, but it is a failure. Continuing with foreign policy, we have the United Kingdom. President Pierce will pressure the United Kingdom to relinquish their colonial interest in the South American coast. This was, of course, mainly areas that were becoming free and independent from the Spanish Empire. The British still had some interests of control on the South American coast, and President Pierce is going to ask them to relinquish their interest. And for the most part, the United Kingdom will ignore the United States. They act as if they're not interested in this at all. Another area we deal with is Nicaragua. An American by the name of William Walker will seize power in 1855 in a coup, and he'll attempt to create a southern colony for the United States. This would be designed to be an eventual southern slave state. Now, he is thrown out of Nicaragua in 1857, but in 1859, he comes back and tries to regain power, and at that point, he is arrested and he is executed by firing squad in 1860. Now, Walker has limited support in the United States. The U.S. government has denounced him, but many in the South were intrigued by the idea. What if we expanded south? There's nothing saying we can't. Manifest Destiny talked about us going from sea to shining sea, from Atlantic to Pacific. But who's to say we can't go north, or more specifically south? So many in the South will begin to look to Central and South America as possible opportunities to expand the United States, and more specifically, slave society. Now looking at domestic policy, let's take a look at American expansion in the 1850s. Stephen A. Douglas will write a bill in 1854. This time he will try to organize the land west of Iowa and Missouri into a new territory, which they will call the Nebraska Territory. This was done to allow the creation of a transcontinental railroad along the northern side of the United States. Now, obviously, the South is going to be upset by this idea because any Nebraska territory would eventually become a free state because of its location relative to the state of Missouri and, of course, the Missouri Compromise. So they decide to come up with a new solution to slavery, and this will be called the Kansas-Nebraska of 1854. The first thing is Nebraska Territory would no longer be one territory, it would be split in half, Kansas and Nebraska. The Missouri Compromise would be completely repealed. There will be no 3630 parallel, and north of 3630 is free and south of 3630 is slave. Now the entire country is open to slavery. Of course, the states themselves would settle the slavery question by popular sovereignty, allowing the state to decide by a direct election. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act will pass Congress, and President Pierce, in consultation with Jefferson Davis, his Secretary of War, and a Southerner, will sign it into law. This will lose him all credibility of fairness in the North. And this will also lead to essentially a collapse in political parties here in the middle part of 1850, you'd say 1854, 1855 time period. In 1854, the Whig Party begins to show signs of collapse, and people become disillusioned with the Democratic Party. So two new political parties emerge. The first is the American Party, sometimes referred to as the Know Nothing Party. This will be a national party that will be linked to the Know Nothing movement, a secret society. This party will be anti-immigrant, anti-black, they considered blacks to be inferior, and they will be pro-slavery in the South, anti-slavery in the North. Essentially, something for everyone. The Republican Party, which was founded here in 1854, is a regional or sectional party, which was centered on the old Northwest Territory and New England. This party would be made up of ex-Whigs, former Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. They will call for freedom and capitalism. They want to see the abolition or at least the reduction of slavery. Now, that is because they wanted everyone, but most specifically white men, to be able to compete for agricultural jobs in the South. So here in 1854, we will have a congressional election, and this will be a referendum on the growing slavery crisis. After the election is held, the Democratic Party will lose a large amount of seats in the North due to their support of slavery. The Whig Party, which was split on the issue of slavery, will lose a large amount of seats throughout the country, and you'll see the Whig Party begin to dissolve. Large amounts of immigrants from Catholic areas will allow the anti-immigrant American Party to prosper, and the anti-slavery sentiment in the North will allow for the Republican Party to gain seats. Now, the Democratic Party and the American Party are the two largest parties here in 1854 in the House of Representatives, but none of the four political parties has enough of a delegation in order to have a majority. So for the first and only time in American history, we have what's called a coalition government. The Democratic Party and the American Party will have to come together to create a majority. And Nathaniel Prentice Banks, a member of the American Party, will be elected to be the Speaker of the House. This will be the only third-party candidate to ever win election as Speaker of the House. In 1856, the Democratic Party will meet in Cincinnati. President Pierce wanted to seek a second term, but he was seen as a political disaster, so he is not renominated by the Democratic National Convention. This is, by the way, the only time in American history an incumbent president is not renominated when eligible for a second term. Instead, they choose James Buchanan Jr., the former Secretary of State, as the nominee for president. They will also choose John C. Breckinridge for vice president. Now, the selection of Buchanan was in part because he was the ambassador to the United Kingdom during Kansas-Nebraska Act, so this allowed for him to escape criticism. The American Party will meet in Philadelphia in February of 1856, and they will select former President Millard Fillmore for President of the United States and Andrew Jackson Donaldson, the nephew of former President Andrew Jackson, for vice president. The Republican Party will meet in Philadelphia in June of 1856. They set a national agenda calling for the prohibition of the spread of slavery, the end of polygamy in the Missouri settlements, and federal assistance for transcontinental railroads. They will select as their nominee Senator John C. Fremont of California for president and William L. Dayton for vice president. Now, during the campaign, the Republicans will call for destroying the slave power, which they saw as destroying the Republican values of America. They opposed the repeal of the Missouri Compromise with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They were against the Ostend Manifesto, and they were against the annexation of Cuba. And as their rallying cry for this campaign, their campaign slogan will be free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory. That's a lot to say. The Democrats will call for preserving slavery. They will warn that electing a Republican would lead to secession of the southern states, and they will firmly support the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the annexation of Cuba, and the Ostend Manifesto. Now, when the election comes around, James Buchanan and John C. Breckinridge will get 1.8 million popular votes, which was about 45.3% of the popular vote, but they get 174 electoral votes, just enough for them to, of course, win the presidency. The second place finisher was a surprising Republican Party. Everyone thought it would be the American Party going in, but it was actually the Republican Party and John C. Fremont. He got 1.3 million votes, 33.1%, and he got 114 electoral votes. Many of those electoral votes coming from the Northeast, New York, Maine, Ohio, Iowa, places like Michigan, Wisconsin. Now, James Buchanan wins the presidency, but the Electoral College vote shows that Republicans could win the next election by winning 2 more states. All they needed to win was Pennsylvania, which at this time was the president-elect's home state, or if they could find a nominee from a state like, say, Illinois, which just happens to be Abraham Lincoln's home state. Now, Franklin Pierce will leave office in March of 1857, reportedly saying that, quote, after the White House, what is there to do but drink? He will retreat into alcoholism and depression. In retirement, he once ran over an elderly woman with his carriage. The only friend to stand with him during his post-presidency was Nathaniel Hawthorne, but his family refused to allow Pierce to serve as a pallbearer at his funeral. During the American Civil War, President Pierce will support the Confederacy, which was now run by his former Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. When the plantation of Jefferson Davis was captured in 1863, his personal letters were made public, showing that he thought the war was anti-state and anti-property. He also called the war, quote, cruel, heartless, and unnecessary, end quote. Harriet Beecher Stowe called him, quote, an arch traitor. And for the most part, the American public will agree. He will die on October 28, 1869, at the age of 64. he dies from cirrhosis of liver after many years of heavy drinking. To look at the legacy of Franklin Pierce, we have to admit that he was not a strong leader. And while he was in office, it was said that the ship of state was adrift. He was personally well liked. Many people saw him as a good man who didn't understand his shortcomings, who was genuinely religious, loved his wife and children, and reshaped himself to fit her ways and to show her true affection. Politically, he was seen as indecisive and heavily influenced, unable to command or provide national leadership when the country needed it the most. Historians rank him as one of the worst presidents and one of the least productive, while some revisionist historians do see him as a fair and friendly person who was simply unable to manage a changing American society. Now, our 15th president is James Buchanan, and James Buchanan will be president from 1857 to 1861. James Buchanan Jr. was born in April of 1791 in Cove Gap, Pennsylvania. He was the son of James Buchanan Sr. and Elizabeth Spear. In 1802, the family moved to Mercersburg, and he will enter Dickinson College in 1805, graduating with honors in 1809. After college, he moved to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, studied the law. He passed the bar exam in 1812. During the War of 1812, he will join the Volunteer Light Dragoons and will aid in the defense of Baltimore, even though he was a politically devout Federalist at the time. He will be our last President of the United States to have been a member of the Federalist Party. He was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He'll serve from 1814 to 1815. He then serves as the U.S. House of Representatives member from Pennsylvania from 1821 to 1831, and then he'll become the United States ambassador to Russia from 1832 to 1833. He joined the Democratic Party in 1834. He was selected to be a U.S. Senator from Pennsylvania, and he'll serve for about 11 years from 1834 to 1845. When Associate Justice Henry Baldwin died in 1844, President James K. Polk actually nominated Buchanan for a seat on the Supreme Court, but he will withdraw his name. He was not interested in being a member of the Supreme Court. So instead, from 1845 to 49, he'll serve in the Polk administration as the United States Secretary of State. During his time at the State Department, he will successfully negotiate the Oregon Treaty that we talked about in the last lecture. From 1852 to 1856, he will be the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. And also, while he's doing that concurrently, from 1852 to 1866, he will serve as the president of the Board of Trustees for Franklin and Marshall University. President Polk is the only president ever elected from the state of Pennsylvania, although now he's one of, I think, 3 that were born in Pennsylvania. He's the only president ever elected from Pennsylvania. He is also the only president to never marry. He will be a lifelong bachelor. Now, in his inaugural address, President Buchanan will promise to serve only 1 term, and he'll also argue that there is no need for any future discussion about the slave issue because the U.S. Supreme Court was hearing multiple cases about slavery and that they would finally decide it once and for all. And he thought this would bring a period of peace to his presidency. What he didn't realize is that this would ignite a flame that would lead to an explosion. Well, the case that James Buchanan was looking forward to happened very shortly after Inauguration Day, and this was the Dred Scott decision. Now, Dred Scott was a slave from Virginia who had been purchased by a U.S. Army surgeon by the name of Dr. John Emerson. In 1833, he was stationed in Illinois, which was a free state, and then in 1836 in Wisconsin, another free state. While he was living in Wisconsin, Scott married with the knowledge and consent of Dr. Emerson. And then in 1837, when Emerson went to St. Louis, Missouri, Emerson did not take Dred Scott with him. He instead rented both him and his wife out in the state of Wisconsin, which this effectively brought slavery to a free state. Emerson left the Army in 1842. He died in 1843. He left Scott and his family to his widow. In 1846, Dred Scott attempted to purchase his freedom, but Dr. Emerson's widow refused. So Dred Scott will sue in the Missouri court in 1846. He argues that his presence and residence in free states dictated his immediate emancipation. The case was dismissed on a technicality in June of 1847. Scott will then be granted a new trial in 1848. Emerson will appeal the decision, and the Missouri Supreme Court will uphold the lower court decision and allow a new trial. That trial will go on, and in 1850, the jury will find that Scott and his family were legally free. The Missouri Supreme Court, though, will overturn that decision, stating that Scott should have sued while living in a free state. This time, Scott will sue again, now in federal court, because he'll sue the executor of Emerson's estate, John Sanford, in 1853. This case would have to be heard in federal court because Scott is living in New York for a period of time, and Sanford, of course, is living there as well. The case is Dred Scott v. Sanford, and this will be decided in 1857. Now, Chief Justice Roger Taney will rule that Dred Scott had no right to sue in federal court as property has no legal protection. That should have been the end of it. That should have been the ruling. But Roger Taney goes further, and he says that the prior slavery compromises that banned slavery from certain states or territories was unconstitutional. And his argument was that property rights are protected by the United States Constitution. Therefore, you can't make a distinction between one type of property or the other. This will now lead to the entire country being reopened to slavery. Now, Roger Taney hoped that this would calm the nation by taking slavery from a contested political issue to settled law. But it actually does the reverse. Northern abolitionists will now become more adamant than ever that they have to end slavery. The Democratic Party, which was at this point the only thing that was unifying the nation, will split into two factions. The Southern Democratic Party, who favored slaves, and the Northern Democratic Party, who is against slavery. This will also encourage secession in the South. Many of the states now believe that they are righteous in their views, and that if someone were to try to take the right of slavery from them, then of course that would give them the right to legally leave the Union. It also leads to a strengthening of the anti-slavery Republican Party. At the same time that the Dred Scott decision is coming down, we also see the beginning of an economic panic, which is called the Panic of 1857. Economic conditions will begin to collapse in the summer of 1857 due to overconsumption of European goods, also overbuilding from competing railroads, and rampant land speculation in the Western territories. President Buchanan will call for reform, not relief, and he promises to continue civil projects that are in progress, but no new ones until the economy recovers. By the time he leaves office in March of 1861, President Buchanan will actually run up a federal deficit of $17 million. Now, the Panic of 1857 is seen by those in the North as a plot by the South. Agricultural, the South suffered less from the economic conditions, and it was their anti-tariff policies that indirectly led to the downturn. It doesn't help that the Southerners begin to say, well, if you would just adopt agriculture and slavery as staples of your economy, you wouldn't have this type of thing. So you do begin to see Northerners become even more bitter towards the South. Another issue that Buchanan will have to deal with is the Utah War of 1857. President Buchanan will begin to receive conflicting reports shortly after his inauguration about Mormons rebelling in the Utah Territory. President Buchanan will send the U.S. Army to Utah in November of 1857. He orders that Brigham Young is to be replaced as the governor of Utah Territory with a non-Mormon by the name of Alfred Cumming. Hostilities are going to be avoided due to diplomacy. Cumming will be installed as the new governor of the Utah Territory, and President Buchanan will grant an amnesty to all the Mormon residents in the territory of Utah. In 1860, we have a presidential election, and President Buchanan had promised not to run for a second term, so the White House will now be open, contested for the parties. The Democrats will meet in Charleston in April of 1860, and the party is deeply divided over the slavery issue. 50 Southern delegates will end up leaving the convention. Those that remain will nominate Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, Senator Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, Governor Horatio Seymour of New York, and Treasury Secretary James Guthrie of Kentucky. Now, Douglas was ahead on every vote into the 57th ballot, but remained 50 votes short of the nomination. When they reconvened in June in Baltimore, another 110 delegates left. So the remaining delegates will nominate Stephen Douglas for president and Herschel V. Johnson of Georgia for vice president. The other Democrats, the Southern Democrats who left, they met in Richmond, Virginia in June, and they will nominate the incumbent vice president, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, and Joseph Lane of Oregon. The Republicans will meet in Chicago, Illinois in May of 1860. Their frontrunners were William Seward of New York, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, and Edward Bates of Missouri. Each of these candidates, though, alienated factions of the party, including Bates, who saw his chances ruined by support of the Know Nothing movement. Out of this, former Representative Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was nominated for president as a compromise candidate, and he chose as his vice presidential nominee Senator Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. The delegates also passed a campaign platform of not allowing slavery to spread any further, imposing tariffs to protect American industry, and a Homestead Act giving free farmland in the West for settlers. Those diehard former members of the Whig and American parties who could not support either the Republicans or the Democrats will meet in Baltimore in May of 1860, and they will nominate John Bell of Tennessee, and they will form what will be called the Constitutional Union Party. The campaign will focus on the motto, "The Union as it is, the Constitution as it is." Now, the campaign will break down into two. In the North, it'll be Abraham Lincoln against Stephen Douglas. In the South, it'll be John C. Breckinridge against John Bell. Douglas had support in the large southern cities, but this was limited to small pockets of the South. Douglas will travel nationwide, stressing the maintenance of the Union. He'll become the first presidential candidate to campaign nationally. The Dred Scott decision will allow the Republicans to dominate the congressional delegations in the North, which gave them easy access to spreading their influence. The Republicans, with their support in the electoral vote-rich North, have an unbeatable advantage in the Electoral College. And so when the popular vote comes down, Lincoln and Hamlin will get 39.8% of the popular vote. Douglas and Johnson will get 29.5%. Breckinridge and Lane will get about 18.1%. And Bell and Everett will get 12.6%. But if you look at this as a half the country versus half the country with two candidates in each sector, If you look at the North, where Lincoln is going up against Douglas, Lincoln wins virtually all those northern states. He wins Oregon, California, plus all the northern states. The only states that he doesn't win in the North, there is a delegate or two from New Jersey that breaks off. And then there's the 9 votes from Missouri that Douglas will get. So even though Douglas and Johnson get the second highest number of popular votes, they actually come in dead last in the Electoral College. If you look at the Electoral College in the South, John C. Breckinridge does quite well. He actually comes in second place to Lincoln, and he pretty much sweeps the South. The only 3 states that John Bell wins are Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Breckinridge probably could have won this election if it wasn't for the fact that there was 2 Democrats and a Constitutional Union party. But they only needed 154 electoral votes, and Abraham Lincoln will get 180, which was good enough to become the next president of the United States. Now, voter turnout in this election was the second highest in American history at that time. 81.2% of the population participated. This will only be surpassed in 1876 when there's a vote of 81.8% turnout. Abraham Lincoln is not even on the ballot in 9 states, and he only wins 2 out of 996 counties in the South. In the states that had slavery, he came in 4th place in all but 1, and that one state was Delaware. John C. Breckinridge wins all the future states of the Confederate States of America except Tennessee and Virginia. Of those that remain in the Union, Breckinridge wins only 2, Delaware and Maryland. Stephen Douglas was not, as I said, was second in the popular vote, but since his support was evenly split amongst the entire country, he barely won any electoral votes. John Bell wins 3 states. So Abraham Lincoln will win this election with an electoral majority, but not a popular majority. President Buchanan will retire to Pennsylvania in 1861. He will spend the next 5 years respectfully quiet due to the American Civil War. He does publish his memoir, Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion in 1866, and he dies on June 1st, 1868 at the age of 78. President Buchanan is remembered for a failure by historians to deal with the secession, and is on most lists of U.S. presidents ranked in the bottom 2, him and Franklin Pierce.